And it's a huge privilege to introduce our next speaker. As you know, from what you've seen in the pre-recorded material and yesterday's sessions, for those of you who were able to join them, we have two entwined themes at this year's festival: events in Ireland in 1921 and Ireland and Empire, or aspects of that huge subject. And there really couldn't be a better person in Irish or European historical circles, for that matter, than Jane Ohlmeyer to give us a long view of that second subject and the way in which Ireland has been both a cockpit and a laboratory for empire and a participant, willing or otherwise, in empire for a very long time. Jane is, as many of you will know, the Erasmus Smith's Professor of Modern History at Trinity, where she was also the founding head of the School of Histories and Humanities. She's originally a historian of 17th century Ireland and Britain. She wrote a pioneering study of the career of the first Marquis of Antrim, but since then she's ranged very widely over the early modern period, the complexity of relationships within these islands, but much more broadly, as we will hear now, and the legacies of some of those relationships for today. And a little bit earlier, and in the midst of COVID, with which we're all still wrestling, she delivered, I think for the first time in their history, the Ford Lectures remotely, and on the subject of Ireland, empire, and the early modern world, on which she's going to build and to speak to us today. So she is no stranger to the challenges of remote delivery of learning, but it's a huge pleasure to welcome you, Jane. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Simon. It's great to join the festival, albeit virtually. I see some old friends in the Zoom room. Obviously, I wish we were all face-to-face, but not to be. Hopefully, you're not all too sick of Zoom, and we'll be able to get a great discussion going later. I'll certainly do all I can to stimulate that. A bit of a health warning. I'm up here in northwest Donegal. Now, there was a great big storm that just has moved through, I hope, I think. But I've taken the precaution of getting Simon to do the slides. So Simon, thank you very much. But it means that I will keep on sort of saying, next slide, please. Hopefully you'll hardly even notice it. Anyway, let's get stuck into this big topic of empire, because empire and imperial policies, practices, and cultures have really shaped the history of the world for the last 2 millennia. It's nation states that are the blip on the historical horizon. Slide, please. So thanks in part to Brexit and the rise of English nationalism and of campaigns around Black Lives Matter and Rhodes Must Fall, we in Ireland are revisiting the history of empire at a moment when we mark and celebrate the formation of our nation state, and hence the sheer appropriateness of the theme for this year's festival. And a number of talks are exploring this, but their focus is very much the 19th and 20th century. And what I want to do is take this conversation back in time to the early modern period, where it really all began. Next slide, please. And 3 interconnected themes underpin my talk today. First, Ireland was England's first colony and formed an integral part of the English imperial system. Second, Ireland served as a laboratory for empire in the Atlantic world and in India. The cockpit was the word that Simon used. Third, as well as being colonised, the Irish operated as active imperialists in the English and other European empires. So those are my 3 big themes. I look at the first 2 quite briefly and spend more on the third. But our first theme then is Ireland as England's first colony. It had obviously formed an integral part of the English imperial system from the Middle Ages, and with the passage of time, bringing with it conquest, colonisation, and commercialisation, Ireland became ever more of a colony. Now, I have written about this along with Anglicisation, or civility, as contemporaries termed it, and the process, people, and policies that worked to make Ireland English. So I'm not really going to dwell on it here, but I would like to share with you Holler's engraving of Hibernia. It's the next slide, which captures both the essence of colonization, cultivation, commercialization, and civility, and the inherent tensions that these brought. So the next slide, please. And it really is this phenomenal engraving by Holler that shows Hibernia as both a shepherdess and a huntress with bees, the symbols of industry and colonization circling her head, and highly prized Irish wolfhounds at her side. The contrasts between the wild forests, no doubt replete with wolves and woodkern, and the cultivated arable and pastoral lands with English varieties of sheep and cattle hint at the tensions that bubbled beneath the surface and regularly erupted in violence. As the numerous rebellions and revolts that occurred over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries illustrate, Anglicization was contested, something that even sources like the 1641 depositions illustrate, even if we traditionally haven't used them to illustrate this, but also the Irish language evidence, especially the poetry and the works of prose. There's historical debate about whether Ireland was a kingdom or a colony or a hybrid combination of both. And Ireland's status as England's first colony has invited comparison by contemporaries and also by historians like D.B. Quinn and Nicholas Canny with other English colonies, especially in the Atlantic world. A generation of scholars have offered nuanced case studies illustrating the interconnectedness of the Atlantic world and the challenges and opportunities that a comparative approach affords. Now, this has sometimes proved controversial, particularly during the Northern Ireland Troubles of the late 20th century. The use of the word colony became politicized, and as did discussions around Ireland's involvement in the British Empire and the extent to which the Republic of Ireland was post-colonial and Northern Ireland colonial. The advent of peace after 1998 has allayed many of these anxieties, even if Brexit is stirring them up again. More recently, Irish history has taken a very healthy global turn. Interest is, albeit slowly, shifting from the political master narrative to multiple narratives that embrace the social, economic, environmental, and cultural histories of the peoples living on the island, along with those who have left, and of Ireland's relationship with the wider world. Of particular importance has been the call for a Kirkham Atlantic approach to history that allows us to escape territorial and national boundaries and to adopt transnational and global frameworks. Equally valuable is the call for a more connected historical approach rather than a strictly comparative one, which allows for the analysis of the transfer and operation of imperialism, albeit in very different contexts. This connected framework also acknowledges differences of geography, scale, culture, and history, which often resulted in local accommodations. Now, I firmly believe that the wider emphasis on transnationalism and global history is really empowering Irish scholars to engage with issues of identity, migration, and empire in a more inclusive, interdisciplinary, entangled, and connected way, and with a recognition that it is impossible to separate imperial history from national history. And this brings me to my second theme, how Ireland served as a laboratory both for imperial rule and for resistance to that rule. How men from Ireland established structures and formulated policies that were first implemented in colonial Ireland and later transferred to other parts of the English Empire. How concepts and tools of empire trialed in Ireland and then adopted, albeit having been adapted to suit local circumstances throughout the early Anglophone world. I'm particularly interested in tools of empire that transcended the early modern period into the 19th century, especially in India. And this included plantation and modes and structures of governance, policies and practices associated with Anglicization, especially the promotion of English culture, language, religion, and education, the law, particularly as it related to the use of land and other natural resources. And finally, knowledge collection. Time precludes a discussion of this just now, but maybe we can come back to it in the Q&A later. Here, I want to reflect on how ideas about and concepts of empire were shaped in Ireland and then exported around the English imperial world. So a discourse of civility and barbarism, and every time I say civility, there are air quotes around it, the same with barbarism. But a discourse of civility and barbarism had long underpinned English imperialism in Ireland. The fact that the political and social organisation, the culture, and the economic practices of Ireland did not coincide with the norms of English society left it open to scorn and led to comparisons with the ancient Britons, whom the Romans had civilized, or with the Amerindians of the New World, or with the infidel or pagan Turks to the east. Next slide, please. Giraldus Cambrensis, also known as Gerald of Wales, writing from a colonial perspective in the 12th century, consistently referred to the Irish as a, quote, barbarous people, a rude people with primitive habits, living themselves like beasts. In his description of the character, customs, and habits of the Irish in his Topographia, Cambrensis argued that Ireland's geographical isolation, quote, from the civilized nations ensured that, again, I'm quoting, they learn nothing and practice nothing but the barbarism in which they are born and bred and which sticks to them like a second nature. Cambrensis was a bestseller across medieval Europe, where the lingua franca of the intelligentsia remained Latin. An English translation of his work was published in another bestseller, Holinshed's Chronicles, and this ensured that early modern readers appropriated this medieval rhetoric, denigrating everything Irish and promoting everything English. Next slide, please. What began as an ideology of cultural difference soon turned into one of cultural superiority and overt racism. John Derrick's Image of Ireland, which was published in 1581, reinforced in prose and with graphic woodcuts negative images of the Irish and vilified them as subhuman, as grasshoppers and caterpillars, as dogs and hogs. Here is the woodcut of the woodkern wearing the much vilified mantle with wolves in the background. Next slide, please. In Ireland, racism, as one Tudor historian put it, reinforced the cant of conquest. The classic exponent of racism during these years was the poet and the Renaissance poet and planter Edmund Spenser, who, in a view of the state of Ireland, called for the wholesale destruction of the Irish along with their culture, society, and economy, and invited England to enjoy a monopoly over the exercise of violence in Ireland. Then, having purged Ireland of its Irishness, the country would be colonised with English settlers responsible for the erection of the political, economic and social framework that was considered the necessary support of a civil life and the Protestant faith. Towns, roads, bridges, houses, gardens, orchards, tillage, enclosure, the clearance of woodlands and the improvement of wastelands would tame and civilise the landscape and its inhabitants. Predictably, Spenser's aggressive imperialism shaped the mindsets of others in his immediate circle, along with later figures like Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford and Lord Deputy of Ireland, who supported the publication of a view in 1633, which prior to this had circulated widely in manuscript. In other words, Spenser's view became a foundational text, much as the writings of Giraldus Cambrensis had in the earlier period, and influenced policymakers from the 17th century well into the 19th century, where it fed into a wider discourse of race and of othering across Asia and Africa. These ethnocentric ideas also permeated the English colonies in the New World. Canny and Quinn have shown how English expansionists, including Sir Walter Raleigh, Humphrey Gilbert, and William Penn, used their Irish experiences to confirm their assumptions of savagism, paganism, and barbarism, and applied these to the indigenous population of the New World. Now, this leads me very nicely to my third theme, how the Irish both Protestants and Catholics served as agents of empire at home and abroad and played active roles in European global expansionism. Next slide, please. But before I look at this, it's important to acknowledge that involuntary migration also characterized the early modern period. For example, Red Hugh O'Donnell, Earl of Tyrconnell, died a political exile in Simancas in 1602. He was buried in nearby Valladolid, where archaeologists have begun to excavate this Franciscan monastery, where they hope to find his remains. Next slide, please. There were many other involuntary migrants. 5 years later, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and many of his associates followed in the flight of the Earls. O'Neill died in relative poverty in Rome in 1616. And then over the course of the 17th century, thousands of Irish soldiers were dispatched to serve in continental armies. From the early decades of the 17th century, indentured servants also left Ireland in significant numbers, while the Cromwellian transportations of the 1650s saw thousands more shipped to the West Indies. And I'll return to them in a moment. But without wishing to downplay the trauma associated with forced migration or engagement in empire in the foot of expropriation, my focus here is on the agency of people from Ireland as they engaged with empire across the early modern world. Who were they? What did they do and why? And where did they go? And as we reflect on geographies, I'll stress eastward enterprises as much as westward ones, since they were as interconnected as colonization and commerce were. Next slide, please. Recent scholarship has highlighted the extent to which Irish people, both Protestants and Catholics, contributed to the imperial activities of the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch global empires, as well as the English one, something that this map attempts to capture, however crudely, with the green dots. Irishmen, for example, participated in the voyages of discovery. William Ayres from Galway allegedly sailed with Christopher Columbus on his historic voyage of 1492 to the Americas. 3 Galway sailors were with Ferdinand Magellan on his circumnavigation of the globe between 1519 and 1522. Others, for whom no record survives, could well have sailed with Vasco da Gama, who after 1497 opened up the direct sea route to Asia. Certainly by 1660, Irish people were to be found in the French Caribbean, the Portuguese and later Dutch Amazon, Spanish Mexico and Cuba, and in English settlements in the Mediterranean, North America, the Caribbean, and in India. At sea, they served in royal navies or as pirates and privateers. On land, they joined colonial settlements, forged commercial networks, and served as administrators, as soldiers, educators, priests, and preachers. So let's begin with the who, before returning to the why, the what, and the where, and concluding with what all of this meant for senses of identity, especially for what it meant to be Irish, for Irishness, and to a lesser extent for Englishness. So who were these agents of empire? Next slide, please. They were often the younger sons or high achievers from humble backgrounds who were usually unscrupulous and great risk takers. I'm going to give you the example of Richard Boyle, Earl of Cork, because he really is an outstanding illustration of a colonial entrepreneur, and he's shown here on the left. A complex web of relationships embedded the Earl in the English imperial system. One of Cork's closest business associates, Daniel Gookin, migrated to Virginia in 1621, but returned frequently to oversee Boyle's commercial interests in the Old World as well as the New. Gookin's factor in Virginia was William Tucker, a close associate of Morris Thompson and his brothers, who monopolized the tobacco trade during the boom years of the 1620s and 30s. From 1631, cargoes of tobacco were shipped from Montserrat to Virginia and from there to County Cork, thereby avoiding customs duties and enriching the Earl and his associates. Cork was also linked to the Caribbean through Fane Beecher, whose father had developed the town of Bandon as part of the Munster plantation and who had left Ireland in 1627 to become the governor of St. Kitts, one of the Leeward Islands. Beecher brought with him financial investment from Cork and later large numbers of indentured servants. Cork enjoyed close connections with Robert Rich, Earl of Warwick, and you can see him here on the right, who was the most enterprising and colonial of English peers and held multiple interests across the English Atlantic, especially in Bermuda and Virginia. And in 1641, Cork's youngest daughter, Mary, here in the middle, married Charles Rich, later Earl of Warwick, and thereby strengthened further the connection. Though Cork may have stood back from direct engagement in colonial enterprise, operating instead through trusted intermediaries, he understood better than any the importance of these social and political networks and of the opportunities afforded by Irish land and labour. Little wonder then that the Earl drew attention to the rich pickings that might be had in the wake of the 1641 rebellion and suggested to his political allies in London that Catholic lands should be confiscated and planted with Protestants. Next slide, please. And this is, of course, exactly what happened. And large fortunes were made during the mid-17th century when 2.5 million acres were expropriated and then sold off. On the foot of this, Catholic landholding dropped from about 54% in 1641 to 23% in roughly 1660. These maps on the screen are derived from the Down Survey project and illustrate in remarkable detail the land transfers, and do check out the website if you're not familiar with it. This mid-century revolution in landholding afforded particular opportunities to an influential London oligarchy of merchant adventurers who, along with a few from Amsterdam, secured these Irish acres during the 1640s at real rock bottom rates. Next slide, please. Today, we would call these merchant adventurers venture capitalists. David Brown's recent pioneering book has made visible this group of roughly 20 men led by Maurice Thompson, whom I mentioned a moment ago. They organised themselves as a corporate body and enjoyed strong links to Westminster MPs, to local civic bodies across London, to England's social and political elite, especially Warwick, to the English Navy and Army. Brown has shown how the adventurers used Irish land to fuel their global expansionism. Irish estates formed part of a portfolio of investments that extended from the fisheries of Newfoundland to the Virginian tobacco plantations, from the sugar colonies in the Caribbean to the trade of spices, coffee, and calicos in India, and of enslaved peoples in West Africa. For the adventurers, Ireland, with its temperate climate, cheap land, and growing population, was a perfect source for raw commodities for manufacture in England, along with a ready source of labour. With the onset of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms in the 1640s, the adventurers became indispensable to the parliamentary cause, funding the war effort, securing Indian saltpetre, which of course was essential for gunpowder manufacture. They transported men and goods and supplied armies, especially in the Irish theatre of war. And then these same men went on to play a key role in facilitating the restoration of Charles II, who in turn guaranteed their Irish landed windfalls. Legislation in the form of the Navigation Acts confirmed their preeminence and privileged the English economy over the Irish economy by creating a political economy of dependency centred on London. Next slide, please. So the adventurers had created on their own doorstep in Ireland a subservient economy, something later endorsed by Sir William Petty. You can see him here, the father of political economy and responsible for the Down Survey I've just mentioned. Petty defined the Irish by their function as reliable producers, providing sustenance and revenue for the English state. He suggested, for example, that the economic value of Irishmen be assessed, and I'm quoting here, as slaves and Negroes are usually rated, with men at £25 and children at £5. By contrast, an Englishman was valued at 70. Next slide, please. It's hard to overstate the importance of London as a city where Anglicising policies were formulated, where lawyers and imperial agents were trained, where joint stock companies were founded, where credit was secured, and where peoples from across the early modern world interacted, networked, and did business. And here is Holler's wonderful map of mid-century London. I've highlighted the coats of arms of the Royal Company of Adventurers, there with the elephant, and of the East India merchants. Cosmopolitan London was for many Irish people a gateway to the early modern world. And by 1600, there were sizable communities of Irish people living in London, and this afforded enterprising Irishmen access to imperial ventures. Next slide, please. These men included Catholic merchants and mariners, along with influential Protestant entrepreneurs such as the Earl of Anglesey, a major political figure in Restoration Ireland and England, whose daughter married John Thompson, the son of Maurice Thompson. As entries in Anglesey's diary record, whilst in London, he regularly attended meetings at the Gambia Company, at the Committee of Trade and Plantations, or with the commissioners from New England and Tangiers, and entertained other entrepreneurs from Ireland who shared his imperial business interests. What motivated these men? Three words capture their motivations: godliness, guns, and gain. And I'd like to look at each briefly. Global confessional networks associated with Anglicanism, Calvinism, and Catholicism shaped many relationships. As members of religious orders, Irish Catholics travelled to the remotest corners of the known world as educators and missionaries. Franciscans and Jesuits from Ireland served in Spanish and Portuguese stations, especially across Latin America, and were seen to have an advantage over their Iberian co-religionists because they could often speak English and therefore countered the work of Dutch and English missionaries. In the Americas, they competed for souls with others trying to create that Anglican Atlantic world, or in the case of the Dutch, one infused by Calvinism. Mercantile interests often mapped onto or were determined by these godly networks. Next slide, please. For example, many of the adventurers in Irish land were also reforming Puritans with strong links to Dutch Calvinists and to the godly settlements of New England, and especially to John Winthrop, the first governor, here in the portrait. Winthrop's uncle was a settler in County Cork. Winthrop's son, also John, in the oval portrait, attended Trinity College Dublin during the 1620s before spending time in the Netherlands. The fact that so many of Trinity's early provosts were reforming Puritans with strong links to Dutch Calvinists made Trinity particularly attractive to those who had colonized the godly settlements of New England. Next slide, please. Missionary zeal drove others. Cork's youngest son, the great scientist Robert Boyle, had a strategy for gospelizing the peoples of India and America that mirrored his plans for Ireland, where he supported translations into Irish of the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and Catechism, and promoted other evangelical activity through the medium of Irish. And you can see here Boyle's Bible, published in 1685 and based on an earlier translation by Bedell. In India, Boyle worked closely with his compatriot, Gerald Ainger. And I know we have an Ainger in our audience. Anyway, Gerald Ainger was the grandson of the Archbishop of Dublin, and he was the founding father of Bombay. But he was very much the John Winthrop of India as well. And he worked very closely with lawmakers to eradicate sin, to promote godly discipline and secure moral regeneration amongst the European colonists. He also did what he could to proselytize, and much as Boyle had advocated, secured translations of the Lord's Prayer, Creed, and Commandments into Portuguese, Hindi, Arabic, and Persian. Turning now from God to guns. Basically from the late 16th century, Irishmen served in their thousands and often involuntarily in the navies and armies of European powers. Those who took up arms for the kings of Spain and France are particularly well documented, especially the wild geese of the post-1690 era, but significant numbers also fought east of the Elbe and in Scandinavian and in the global armies of European powers. Next slide, please. Less well known is the fact that from the 1690s, Ireland's major contribution to the English Empire was, as Ivor McGrath reminds us, quote, the financing, housing, and general maintenance of a peacetime standing army that was capable of going to war in Britain's interests at short notice. In other words, Irish troops were the backbone of the military machine during the 7 Years' War, fought between Britain and France for global supremacy. As the map shows, French and British armies battled it out in Europe, North America, and in India, but also in the Caribbean and West Africa. And this brings us nicely to the third motivation, greed. Next slide, please. The early decades of the 17th century and the opening up of the New World was the heyday of Irish piracy. In this image, we can see how the landscape near Crookhaven in County Cork bears witness to the smuggling rampant during those years, something that Connie Kelleher, a marine archaeologist, has vividly captured in her recent book, and I'm grateful to Connie for these images. From their bases along the southwest coastline of Munster, Irish pirates ranged as far as Harbour Grace in Newfoundland, to Mamora in northwest Africa, to Tunis and Algiers in the Mediterranean. Abroad, they formed part of an international network, and at home, they operated in cahoots with smugglers and entrepreneurs based along the Irish coastline, including, of course, the ubiquitous Boyles of Cork. Next slide, please. Commissioned by the Dutch, this chart of the Southwest dates from 1612 and shows some of the favourite haunts of local pirates. 2 years later, in 1614, the Dutch entered the harbour of Crookhaven and attacked the pirates there along with the townspeople. Then in 1631, Barbary pirates sacked the nearby town of Baltimore and made captive at least 100 people. Piracy may have brought great gains to communities along the Munster coastline, but it was also a very high risk venture. Less high risk was trade. It also brought risks. And I want to turn now to look at some of the commercial networks that men from Ireland formed, centred primarily in London and Dublin, but also Amsterdam and Lisbon, where they traded lucrative imperial commodities like calicos, spices, sugar, and tobacco. Next slide, please. And I'd like to look at by way of example, the profits to be made from Indian textiles. Initially, the focus was very much for household consumption. Tablecloths, bed linens, and floor coverings like this magnificent one that dates from about 1650 on your left. But increasingly, there was demand for cotton items of clothing for both men and women, and this beautiful calico dress in what became known as the calico craze. The profits to be made on successful voyages were huge. The company paid out generous dividends of between 10 and 20% to its shareholders, and the value of stock rose significantly from £90 in 1661 to £240 in 1677. And this was in large part the achievement of Gerald Ainger, whom I've just mentioned and to whom I'll return. Others profited from trafficking in human cargoes of indentured servants and enslaved people. Though the English Royal Africa Company banned Irish merchants from trading directly in enslaved people, a handful did. Others benefited indirectly. Men from Ireland served as captains and sailors on slave ships based in Liverpool, as exporters of barreled butter, salt beef, herrings, and other goods, and as owners and traders of enslaved peoples, especially on sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Next slide, please. Very occasionally, there are references to Black slaves in Ireland itself. In this image of Lady Arran's funeral, you can see she's being waked here in Dublin in 1669, and there's a Black servant in the bottom right-hand corner. Further south in St. Mary's Church in Youghal, the baptism is recorded in 1666 of David, formerly known as Lampo, and then I'm quoting, a Negro aged 15 years or thereabouts, born in Montserrat, one of ye Caribbean islands. This mention of Montserrat in the Caribbean, or the West Indies, as it's also known, invites discussion of where did the Irish go. Here, my focus on empires inevitably becomes intertwined with a more general discussion of migration, although I'll try to disentangle the two. From the next slide, please. From the early decades of the 17th century, an average of 50 men a year migrated to continental Europe, and if women and children are included, it was probably around sorry, not 50, 500 men. And if women and children are included, it stands at 700. And this is much, much higher than the numbers who crossed the Atlantic. These are Cullen's figures. But of course, migration wasn't a regular and ordered event. Rather, it occurred in waves. It was often involuntary and in the wake of economic and political crisis at home. In other instances, it was associated with trading networks, pilgrimage routes, or fishing activities. And to some extent, geographic perimeters within which these movements occurred were predictable. For example, Irish Catholics tended to move or enjoy close relationships with the Catholic states of Italy, France, Spain, Spanish Netherlands, and the other Habsburg or pro-Habsburg states of Eastern and Central Europe, whereas Irish Protestants oriented themselves towards Northern Europe, Scandinavia, the Baltic, and United Provinces. However, I want to emphasize that any sectarian analysis is too rigid. The economic and commercial considerations of many, and especially the Dutch, consistently overrode religious and political matters. And perhaps this is why we see Irish Catholics, a man called Bernardo O'Brien and his colleagues, the de Courcy's, Moores and Mulryans from County Clare, working as tobacco and timber merchants in the Dutch Amazon during the early decades of the 17th century. Of course, this may be linked to the relationships forged back in Ireland when the Earl of Thomond encouraged Dutch tenants to settle on his estates. Whatever the reason, Bernardo O'Brien befriended the local Tupi peoples, learned their language and how to navigate the complex waterways at the mouth of the Amazon. No wonder the Dutch were keen to do business with him, even if he was Catholic, and also worked alongside the English and the Portuguese. The levels of interaction and the nature of the contact between merchants, scholars, and soldiers from Ireland and those of their host nations were diverse, ranging from transient visits to permanent settlement, and often involved extensive internal mobility and migration in multiple geographies. As the 17th century progressed, permanent settlements emerged, often around merchant communities, such as those in Spain. And in Spain, we're really talking about Cadiz, La Coruña, Malaga, Sevilla, and Bilbao. And the other important centres are in France, Bordeaux, La Rochelle, and Cognac. Particularly important are the Atlantic ports, Cadiz, Nantes, and Bordeaux, which afforded Irish merchants, soldiers, and sailors easy access to colonisation and to slave trading and to the sugar production of the New World. Scholars are beginning to recover the depth and range of Irish engagement with these European empires, albeit mostly for the later 17th and 18th centuries. And for instance, Igor Tostados and Oscar Morales have done some fascinating research on the Spanish on the Irish in the Spanish West Indies. Fionnuala O'Kane's work on Irish migrants to the French colony of Saint Dominique, modern day Haiti, has also been trailblazing. Next slide, please. But the range and diversity of experiences is illustrated here by a single example, that of the Lamport siblings, Catherine, John, Gerald, and William. They left Wexford during the early part of the century. Catherine found a new life on the continent as a nun. John became a Franciscan friar. Gerald served as a soldier in the army of the Philip II of Spain. William attended the Irish College at Santiago de Compostela before crossing the Atlantic to Mexico, where he went on to claim the throne of New Spain, alleging that he was the legitimate heir of Philip III. He wrote the first proclamation of Mexican independence in 1642, which was the year after the 1641 rebellion had broken out in Ireland, which advocated for the freedom of African slaves and the return of lands to the indigenous Indian population. Later captured, Lamport was tried by the Inquisition and in 1659 burned alive for heresy and sedition. Next slide, please. A statue of Lamport stands inside the vestibule of Mexico City's most important monument to national independence, and it recognizes Lamport as a hero, just as Bernardo O'Higgins would later be celebrated in Chile or Admiral William Brown in Argentina. It has also been suggested that Lamport was the inspiration behind the fictional character of Zorro, And hopefully Zorro will appear. There we are. As the example of Lamport illustrates, it was often through their contacts with France and Spain that Irish Catholics began to cross the Atlantic, working as subversives, soldiers, servants, and missionaries. I want to have a very quick look at Spanish Cuba, which attracted people from Ireland from the early 17th century. The next slide shows us a map by John Speed of the Americas. Now, Speed was an English cartographer whose maps of Ireland circulated widely and are well known. Next slide, you can see very clearly Cuba in the middle there. And in the next slide, you can see this wonderful depiction of Havana. The church spires are visible in an urban landscape. Rural areas surround the city. The entrance to the port is flanked by walled fortresses, and a ship is sailing towards the port. You know, Havana hasn't changed that much. It's really quite incredible. It's the most exquisite early modern city. Next slide, please. In the 1650s, Irish transplantees to the English colonies of Barbados and Jamaica later migrated on to Cuba. Juan Duagne from Connacht helped to construct the fortifications in Santiago, which is southeast Cuba, and his descendants went on to play a very important role on the island. Many others, including Juan's son Ambrosio, made their fortunes in sugar production. Ricardo O'Farrell from Montserrat and before that County Longford also came to Cuba, where he became one of the most notorious Irish figures involved in the Atlantic slave trade. So I've given you here a flavour of Irish engagement with the continental empires, but this is just the tip of an iceberg. We need scholars to work through the archives of the Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, and French in order to understand fully the scale of the Irish contribution to these empires, which I believe is very considerable, but largely overlooked. Next slide, please. Much better known is Irish involvement in the English Atlantic Empire. Yet during the first half of the 17th century, the overall numbers crossing the Atlantic were relatively small, and probably 200 per year during the first half of the century and 400 during the second. And again, it's Cullen's figures. More than 75% of the total were indentured servants, mostly men under the age of 25 who were from the lowest social economic sector of society, typically unskilled or semi-skilled servants or vagrants. During the early decades of the 17th century, Lord Deputy Chichester forcibly transplanted indentured labourers from Wexford to St Kitts, and Sir Edward Blaney, a Welsh planter who'd made his fortune in Ulster, transplanted 153 men and 50 maids and young women from Ireland to Virginia. Each person was worth £150 of tobacco, which was to be paid to Blaney upon delivery. As the sugar rush gained momentum, this trafficking of humans increased, and during the 1650s, the Cromwellian authorities shipped thousands of Irish Catholics directly to the English colonies in the Caribbean. Others were sold at the Dutch slave market at Pernambuco, which would be in modern day Recife in northeast Brazil. There, Irishmen were sold for between 10 and 13 pounds, which was half the cost of an enslaved man from Africa. Next slide, please. I mentioned Brazil simply because I think it's always important to remember that more African slaves were shipped to Brazil than anywhere else, and it was a very important and often we don't include this discussion of Brazil when we talk about the English Atlantic. And this incredible image from 1641 is of an idealized slave in Brazil by the Dutch painter Albrecht Echthocht, and it's in the National Museum of Copenhagen. Of course, though, the picture disguises the grim reality and the horror of slavery. Next slide, please. From the perspective of Ireland, the West Indies, or the Caribbean, which really was the hub of the Atlantic trading system, it's far more significant than the mainland colonies, both as a destination for traders and migrants and in economic terms. And from the early decades of the 17th century, significant numbers of Irish people migrated to this area, again, often as indentured servants, and especially to Barbados and the Leeward Islands. So the Leeward Islands there, Nevis, Antigua, St Kitts, Montserrat, and Montserrat to this day is known as the Irish island. And there they made up the lion's share of the non-African workers. By the mid-17th century, leading Irish merchant families had established themselves on Barbados and the Leeward Islands, where Irish capital funded the lucrative tobacco and later sugar trade. And by 1639, there were some 3,000 Irish Catholics living on the Leeward Islands. Next slide, please. Montserrat was described in 1634 as, quote, a noble plantation of Irish Catholics, and in 1668 as almost an Irish colony. By the 1670s, an Irish Catholic governor from Tipperary, William Stapleton, had amassed governorships of all the English Leeward Islands and married a rich English heiress from Nevis. Like members of the landed elite back in Ireland, Stapleton supported with enthusiasm the imperial venture by building parish churches, maintaining Anglican clergy, and taking every opportunity to demonstrate his loyalty to Charles II. And during Stapleton's tenure, Irish Catholics, mostly from Connaught and Munster, represented 69% of the white population on Montserrat. They rose to positions as elected assemblymen and came to hold numerous positions of importance alongside English colonists and others of Irish Protestant background. Merchants like Henry Blake of Galway amassed small fortunes, often on the back of sugar produced by enslaved Africans. And by 1729, the majority of the nearly 6,000 slaves on Montserrat were owned by Irish families, including the Farrells, Hussies, Lynches, Roaches, and others. Donald Aikinson's case study of Montserrat shows that the Irish, and I'm quoting here, schooled in early English imperialism, became aggressive and expert imperialists and slave masters themselves. These slave masters included those who had arrived as indentured labourers in the 1650s. One such man was Cornelius Bryan, who by 1680 had acquired a modest estate of 22 acres in St. James's Parish, Barbados, where he was the master of 2 servants and 9 enslaved people. He died in 1687, leaving a feather bed, a cedar chest, a black horse, and 13 slaves. Next slide, please. White supremacists, especially in the US, have misleadingly suggested that Irish indentured servitude in the 17th century equated to white chattel slavery and thereby distort the true meaning and misery of Black slavery. Memes like these are favorites of online racists. We also need to remember that at least 30% of 30% of African Americans with Irish heritage will find their roots in very dark places. And no doubt the figure would be higher still if we included the Caribbean. Next slide, please. The emphasis by scholars on engagement with westward enterprises is understandable given the scale of Irish migration to the Caribbean and later the American colonies. However, this does need to be combined with research into Irish contributions to eastward enterprises, especially as members of the East India Company. Closely linked to this is the intimate interplay between commerce and colonization and the importance of challenging, much as Phil Stern has done, the traditional distinctions between the commercial and colonial eras in British India, as well as the distinct notions of a colonial Atlantic world and the trading world of Asia. Next slide, please. The other thing to bear in mind is the extent to which the merchant adventurers had, by the early 1650s, taken over control of all of England's external trade, including that of the East India Company. So at the risk of oversimplification, the adventurers, led by the Thompson clan, traded enslaved Africans for Spanish silver and sugar from Barbados. They then used this silver to buy Indian textiles, which in turn could be exchanged for more slaves. I've already said these adventurers enjoyed significant landed connections in Ireland. And by the 1660s and 1670s, of the 73 men who served as directors of the East India Company, over half of them had subscribed to the Adventurers Act of March 1642, which offered Protestant speculators 2.5 million Irish acres, and to subsequent schemes that underpinned the Irish Revolution in landholding of the 1650s. Next slide, please. For some directors of the East India Company, like the Thompsons, Ireland simply formed part of a portfolio of global investments. For others, the Irish links were stronger, and at least 10 directors had close family members living on Irish estates. I'm going to give you a single example here, and it's the example of Sir Joseph Ashe, who's pictured, and he was Gerald Ainger's great patron. Ashe was a West Country textile industrialist, one of the most influential directors of and largest investors in the East India Company. And during the early decades of the 17th century, Ashe's father's cousins had acquired lands in County Meath and Cavan. Then during the 1640s, Ashe's brothers adventured £1,200 and received 1,200 acres in County Tipperary, where a nephew then settled. And then the strongest links of all, of course, were held by the polymath Robert Boyle, who was a company director and son of our colonial entrepreneur Cork. Boyle was so well placed to build on the trusted relationships developed by his father. The point I'm really making here is a significant cohort of directors of the East India Company would have been very familiar with how colonization in Ireland operated and had some direct knowledge of it. And one can imagine that these experiences, along with other imperial encounters, especially in the Caribbean and North America, informed their thinking as they debated about how best to proceed in Bombay. And we're going to turn now to Bombay. And next slide, please. Which is very much a current research interest of mine. Charles II had been given Bombay as part of his marriage settlement with the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza, and he then entrusted it to the East India Company on the condition that they guaranteed freedom of worship to the Portuguese Catholics, which had been agreed in the marriage settlement. For its part, the East India Company welcomed the acquisition of Bombay, which had been a Portuguese settlement since the 1630s. Bombay at this point was a H-shaped island that formed part of an archipelago of 7 little islets and enjoyed an extraordinary natural harbour. Though never developed as a trading hub by the Portuguese, the English immediately realised Bombay's potential to become a major commercial centre in the wider Indian Ocean trading world. And from the onset, the company had ambitious plans for Bombay, and they were determined to make it an English colony. Next slide, please. As a colonial port forward, Bombay was the Indian equivalent to the city of Derry. Remember that in 1609, King James VI and I had charged the London livery companies to develop the city and colonise the entire county. And this initiative occurred under the auspices of the Irish Society, a joint stock company modelled on the 1600 Charter of the East India Company. And very interestingly, the membership of the Irish Society overlapped with that of the company for much of the 17th century. But Bombay, of course, was primarily an English colony. Even so, it's very interesting when we look at the censuses that we see the presence of soldiers with Irish Catholic names. There are Butlers, Barnwells, Kennedys, Talbots and O'Neills. And of course, Gerald Ainger was the founding father, and he was the grandson of active colonists who'd moved to Ireland during the early decades of the 17th century. And Ainger's experiences of Bombay really shaped how he conceived of and executed policy in Bombay. He was also a hugely successful entrepreneur and businessman. Next slide, please. Both in Surat, the most famed emporium of the Indian Empire, where Ainger spent most of the 1660s, and then in Bombay in the 1670s, Ainger proved a very successful agent for the company while enriching himself in the process. Next slide, please. And this is where money was made. It was with black pepper from Bantam and Malabar. It was very much a staple import from Surat, along with coffee, which came from Yemen, cinnamon, cardamom, and other spices. But by the later 17th century, the company made the bulk of its profits from importing Indian textiles in the 1670s, when Ainger was president, with those boom years of the calico craze. What I find so fascinating, though, obviously Ainger made his fortune in Bombay and Surat, but he also took much from his time living in Mughal India, including examples of commercial best practice, an extensive mercantile network that was truly cosmopolitan, and an understanding of the importance for business of religious pluralism and cosmopolitanism. Next slide, please. He also appears to have developed an appreciation of the region's religions, languages, and cultures, and secured rare Persian texts, many of them from local Piracy Zoroastrians, which he then sent back to Thomas Hyde, who was the librarian at the Bodleian in Oxford. And here's an example of one, a chronicle of the Persies, which is now in the British Library. Alison Games has noted how entrepreneurs like Ainger, familiar with foreign languages and cultures and curious about the world in which they operated, wove a web of empire. And in Ainger's case, we clearly see that he is connecting Ireland, India, and England. And I want to just now begin to draw a few conclusions here by reflecting on issues around identity and asking what all of this meant for Ainger's sense of identity. Next slide, please. Ainger's funeral monument survives in the English cemetery in Surat. You can see it here. I've already told you that he was a very zealous Protestant, the grandson of an archbishop, yet there is no hint here of his Christianity, never mind the fact he was a European or born in Ireland. Yet throughout his life, Ainger's links to Ireland remained very strong, despite his cosmopolitanism and his global interactions. Though he may have seen and described himself as an Englishman, his Irishness was very closely held. He remained in very close contact with his siblings who inherited. But interestingly, his boss in the East India Company touched on this when he congratulated Ainger on his English and then added in parenthesis, I was going to say Irish, fortitude and forbearance. Now, for me, this exchange captures the extent to which Ainger's Englishness was refracted through the lens of Ireland. Of course, strictly speaking, Ainger was a member of the New English, as people from England who settled in Ireland from the 1530s became known. Yet he was born and raised in Ireland, as were his parents. He had close kin links to other New English families and the Old English House of Kildare, many of whom were Catholic, and indeed he was named after his great uncle Gerald Fitzgerald, 14th Earl of Kildare. The listing of books by Irish clerics and Irish legal authorities in the inventory of the library at Surat also highlights his continued attachment, while a number of his policies, the policies he developed in Bombay, including his legal code and his landed policies and his attempt to make his city colony English, had clearly been influenced by his experiences of colonial Ireland. In short, Ainger's identity, like his life story, was as complicated as the operation of early modern empire itself. And this is true of so many other Protestants that I've been looking at, whether they are in India or in the Atlantic world. So much for the Protestants. What then of Catholics from Ireland? Because Irish Catholic identity formation was also complex. Ireland's very proximity to England and the deep-seated loyalty of so many Irish Catholics to the House of Stuart could compromise the position of Irish Catholics eager to secure favour abroad or to serve Catholic princes. In the case of Bernardo O'Brien, whom I mentioned earlier, his attempts to secure Spanish support for his colony in the Amazon basin ultimately failed because the Spanish authorities feared that he would bring in the heretics, and they meant, of course, the English Protestants. In an insightful article on Ireland in the Atlantic World, William O'Reilly dismissed as misleading any attempt to represent the Irish in the Atlantic as a diasporic community united by Catholicism. Instead, O'Reilly argues that the majority actively engaged in an international labour market, determined to make better lives for themselves and their families. And my findings completely support this. I'm also seeing some Catholics, especially those on the make, think of Stapleton, who used every opportunity, especially marriage, education, and social interactions, to recharge their Englishness. And they did so without this compromising their religion. So let me now conclude by fast forwarding to the present, where the legacy of empire today is as complex as the operation of empire was back in the 17th century. And the next slide, please. I'm very conscious of the current charged political context in which discussions of empire are taking place. Over the course of this year, we have been debating how we might decolonize Irish history. In Trinity, we've launched a major legacy of empire research project that really wants to document the college's engagement with empire from its foundation in 1592. There have been heated public and academic discussions, including a very powerful reflection on empire by President Higgins back in February. An opinion piece I published in the Irish Times in December generated comment. So many people contacted me with stories of being born in India, Hong Kong, or Africa, and with stories of a family member who had worked in colonial service, administrators, teachers, healthcare workers, nuns, priests, soldiers, and so on. There was also a mini storm on Twitter with a small and anonymous group of racist extremists launching toxic attacks. Now, all of this really demonstrated to me that our history, so core to our identity, really does matter. And like it or not, empire and colonialism has profoundly shaped us as it shaped our ancestors and people from Ireland living in the early modern world. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to having a discussion.
Jane, thank you. And I know that there'll be lots of questions that people will want to pursue. The first one that has come through is about the Honourable the Irish Society, and I guess it's a comment, but I'd be interested in your reflections on it. I mean, clearly those lineaments of commercial power linking London to plantations in Ireland, in Ulster, of course, but more broadly, and then what are in a sense that their legacy is still with us. The institutions themselves, in the case of the Honourable the Irish Society, still exist, and it does charitable work across. But what's your reflection on that? I mean, what is it? Is it just an intriguing relic, or how do you think we should consider that ongoing reality?
Well, the fact it is ongoing, the fact that it clearly means something to people, and it was very interesting during the recent 400th, anniversary of the plantation, how active the society in London was. It funded a whole series of events in, to my mind, a very sensitive way. They wanted to tell the story, warts and all, which I think is very important. Nobody's glorifying anything here, especially when it comes to plantation. And there was absolutely no attempt to do that. They funded a wide range of conferences and events, a lot of it actually in the city of Derry, other events in London. They also have a phenomenally important archive and have done an awful lot to make that archive available. So, my sense is that as long as these bodies and organizations exist, and it's very important that the dialogue continues, and certainly I've been very struck about the way that in this case the aldermen, the City of London, have engaged in a very, to my mind, responsible, and I mean that in a very non-inflammatory. It's all about dialogue, it's all about discussion, it's all about actually, well, what are the archives telling us way, and I think that's all to the good. So that would be just my general reflection on that particular institution, because as you say, they are very much a part of the present. It's not a relic of the past.
And I suppose that prompts one obvious question building on that, which is, are there other such entities which, in reflecting other parts of imperial endeavor, might, if they chose to, play similarly responsible, similarly illuminating roles now, or is that in a way a sort of consequence of the very particular intimacy, in a way, in the relationship between Ireland and England?
Oh, do you know something? I think it's hugely important, Simon, and I think actually universities have a very, very important role to play here. most of the universities established in Ireland, certainly Trinity, but also the Queen's universities, so Galway, Cork, Belfast, were all instruments of empire, if you want. It's not just that, they were actively Anglicizing within Ireland, but they also then became incubators, training especially civil servants, but also engineers, doctors for service, particularly in India, but across the British Empire. So I think, it's very important that we in universities look at that. We also need to reflect on the extent to which our buildings, our endowments, our libraries have been funded on the back of empire, and particularly anything related to slavery, and that's where sugar and tobacco money really come in. So that is very important that discussion happens. But it's not just the universities. I think many of our museums, the Royal Dublin Society, the RDS, the National Museum, bodies like the Royal Irish Academy, they all have very interesting pasts and sometimes very complex relationships with empire. And I think that discussion is now beginning in an Irish context, but it really is beginning. And I think what complicates it enormously in Ireland is obviously the political situation. And that's where historical rigor is very important, that it's all about documenting it. It's all about what are the archives telling us here, to get away from the anecdotal and to ensure that whatever conversations we're having are grounded in evidence. And until, in a sense, we do that, it's very hard to know where it's going to take us. But we've seen this in a Trinity context with the Berkeley Library. Obviously, George Berkeley, one of Ireland's great philosophers, but he owned slaves when he was in Rhode Island. And that has complicated, should we be renaming the Berkeley Library? Edmund Burke. Obviously, Edmund Burke excoriated empire, especially what was going on in India, but yet a very recent book has really proved unequivocally that he was involved in plantations in the Caribbean, his brother and Burke. So, I mean, it's very important that we have the evidence and that we get a complete picture. So this is where institutions have a particular role to play, and it's very heartening to see the way institutions are stepping up to the plate.
Yeah, and as you say, revealing those warts from time to time. Paul Newton is asking a very interesting question, which in a way builds on something we were discussing in a different context yesterday with John Horn and the panel that was considering the actions of Crown forces in Ireland during the revolutionary period. But he asks whether this proximity, the closeness of the relationship between England and Ireland meant that that there was a difference in the way in which Ireland was considered, notwithstanding that what you pointed to early on, the Spencerian language about the Irish as barbarous. By the later period, the 19th and 20th century, Paul is wondering where do the Irish sit in the taxonomy of empire then in your reading?
It's a really good question, and it's a vexed one, Paul, because it's so loaded politically. So I'm going to, obviously, from the perspective of the 16th, 17th, early 18th century, for me, Ireland is very much a colony, and there's no, this pretense of it being a kingdom is really a pretense. I would argue that you see it, from the early 17th century, and at the very latest from the mid 17th century, where it's, a subservient economy as well. The Anglicization that has gone in the earlier period, I would argue you're saying cultural, what we would call today cultural imperialism. Now, as we start to get into the later period, after 1800, so of course, all of a sudden, is there a switch flicked and does it all change? I would argue not. I think there's tremendous continuity. And I think it's very interesting that when we look at things, for example, like governance, I'm very interested in Ireland and India and the comparisons over time, and whether it's policing, whether it's education, the structures of government. Ireland and India India is the largest colony, Ireland's the oldest, but I mean, the similarities are very, very striking indeed. I think the difference, though, is the scale to which the Irish do both. In other words, that obviously we are a colony. I see that right through. So in other words, for me, that does continue into the later period. And this notion of proximity, I think, is a red herring, honestly, because I think when we look at colonies, other colonies, especially landed ones like the Russian Empire, proximity doesn't mean that some of their satellites, some of those proximate regions aren't colonies as well. So yeah, I'm very much in the colonial framework here, but recognize that it is contested, and that recognizing that people can have multiple identities, and I think that that does happen, and that's what you would expect to see. But the direction of travel is as a colony, not as an equal partner and player.
And it's very interesting. One of the examples you showed, Jane, of the recent discussion is about Sir Michael O'Dwyer, who seems to have managed to show that multiple personality set of characteristics, both as an active and a very effective colonial administrator on one hand, and quite an advanced nationalist in his thinking about how Ireland's future should play out. So that, as you say, that plurality in one person, maybe not such an unusual thing, although he's a particularly prominent example.
Well, do you know something? And of course, it's O'Dwyer that gets people very stirred up, because they'll say, well, just because he was Irish doesn't, don't tar us all with this brush. And, it gets very hot and interesting in an Irish, it's not the Punjab. It was a Dwyer and an O'Dwyer. So it was the governor of the Punjab as well as the man who, if you want, ordered the, one was Irish and the other one was educated in Middleton. And they obviously, as you say, O'Dwyer had these multiple identities. Seamus Nevin's article is very interesting on this, but also there's a book recently, I'm sure you've read it or others have, called The Silent Assassin, which looks at that story in a very, I think actually very measured way. And Rita, I forget her second name. Anyway, and it's very interesting when I spent a lot of time working in India, and people in India feel very uncomfortable when it comes to talking about Amritsar and the Irish association with Amritsar, because colleagues in India want to see the Irish as victims of imperialism. And there's a discomfort when you have to recognize that actually some Irish people actually were very active perpetrators of imperialism. And it just wasn't what happened at Amritsar. You look at somebody like John Nicholson, who was an imperial psychopath, and some of the atrocities that were committed in 1857, some people call it the Indian Mutiny, or the first Indian War of Independence. Something like 2/3 of the British Army in India were made up of Irishmen, and certainly by the 1890s, there were 8 provinces in India, and 7 of the 8 provinces were governed by Irishmen. And the Lord Deputy was Lord Dufferin, who, of course, came from a Scottish planter family. So, it does get messy. It does get complicated. I would be arguing that even to understand what's going on in the 19th century in India, you have to take that story right back to, basically the 1660s with Ainger, that there is this continuity from that period into the more modern period.
I think it's Anita Anand, isn't it?
Anita Anand, that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
As we get more ambitious and possibly grow deeper pockets, we'd hope to have Anita come and speak to us at some point at the festival. I see a question from David Reynolds, and before we come to the end of our time, it would be great to have your reflection on him. He is going to be on our panel tomorrow, which is a group of historians from both Ireland and Britain reflecting on the different kinds of selective memory. And Jane, you've illuminated very particularly some of the aphasia, I think David Fitzpatrick insisted on distinguishing it from amnesia, but anyway, about Empire in Ireland. But he asks, how far would you extend that reflection on Ireland's status as a kind of ongoing colony, even into the 19th century, with that of Scotland?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I'm looking forward to the panel tomorrow. I think Scotland, it's a different history. The fact that Scotland is, independent right up until 1603. It's a province rather than a colony, obviously, and the Scots. So for me, what's going on in Ireland is very different to what's going on in Scotland, and the extent to which the Scots are actively colonising Ireland as well, I think, is important. And that colonisation of Ireland goes right back. So my early work, and Simon, obviously, you know this as well as I do, is the MacDonalds of Antrim. There's been this active colonisation going on from the Middle Ages. It may only be state-sponsored from the early 17th century, but you have had extensive migration. And then, some of the Scots become some of the most active colonists in Ireland. I mentioned Dufferin a moment ago. I was up at Dunluce. I haven't been up in North County Antrim for a long time, but I went up last weekend, and Glenarm, Rathlin, Bonamargy, Dunluce. And, it's 12 miles between Torhead and Scotland. You could see it. It was a clear day. So, it's a tricky one. And obviously the relationships are very, very, very close. But I think Scotland, is different, and you don't get that active colonisation of Scotland by Ireland that you get of Ireland colonising the Scots. The Scots actively colonise the Irish. It is different. Anyway, so David, I hope that answers your question. A man called Andrew McKillop, who's at the University of Glasgow, has done some fascinating work here looking at the Irish and the Scots in India. And obviously the Scots are hugely important in the East India Company earlier than the Irish, they tend to, so the Irish tend to be the rank and file, the cannon fodder, whereas the Scots will, and Irish Protestants will be officers if we're just looking at the army. The Scots, it's not so much the cannon fodder. They have sort of, if you want, higher ranking. They do better on the back of empire than the Irish do. And his book, I think, is coming out in September, which will take that story from the late 17th century right into the 19th century. And that sort of comparative work where the nuances are fully worked out, I think is extremely important. And obviously, I'm really looking forward to that. But we need to do more comparative work of where the Irish and the Scots, same with the Caribbean, the Scots are there, compare those experiences. Anything that will chip away at exceptionalism, I think is good, but also, it relishes the differences because they are different.
And I think we've got time for one more, Jane, if you can bear with us. And that's from Patricia McKee, who's referring to Terry Eagleton's work. Are you familiar with that? And maybe just your reaction to that reading?
Anything in particular? Does Patricia want to comment on anything? But I am familiar with Terry Eagleton's work. I just wondered what in particular she was, she wants me to respond to.
His work in,
oh,
you can be heard.
I'm here, I'm hidden. I just thought he has a categorization which is a subtlety between colonialism per se and the colonial Irish intellectual. And it is a very interesting and nuanced analysis of what was happening, I think, from the Dublin Society and the Trinity intellectuals, but not necessarily those who would be classed as academics or who were an emerging middling class. So I just thought that he has put a lot of thought into the subversiveness of this category of Irish intellectuals, and that they didn't take the blanket approach to colonialism. And I know in my own research in the archives of Trinity, there was an awful lot of criticism of the Parliament of Westminster, to the point where you would almost think that they were on the side of those who thought Ireland should govern themselves. And this was the mid-19th century.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And, Patricia, I absolutely agree with you there. And I think this is where Ireland can be very interesting as an exemplar, if you want, of resistance to empire too. And what you're talking about and what Terry's talking about is obviously for the slightly later period. But absolutely. I suppose all I would caution is that, especially when we're looking at it from a Protestant perspective, at the end of the day, it's all about wanting to protect their own vested interests. And you can never escape from that. So they may be wanting to resist empire, but the reason they're doing it is because London is actually attacking their position, much as it did the Catholic position in the earlier period. And going back to somebody like Burke, again, here you have this great critic of empire who wasn't averse to investing in it in the Caribbean as well. So I think we just need to approach all of this with sort of eyes wide open. And I think the current discussions around slavery and many of these people who would be, if you want, subversives, also are actively engaged in slaving in some form or fashion. So it's the hypocrisy that goes with it. So that would be my only slight health warning.
Well, Jane, as we've said about almost everything we cover in the festival, nobody ever has quite the final word, and particularly not in an area where such interesting ongoing work is continuing. But thank you for bringing it to us in such a lively way. Thank you for your patience with our technical hitches. And we should just say, Connie Kelleher, whose work you mentioned and whose images from Crookhaven has twice been a speaker at the festival. So it's great to see her work being highlighted again by you.
Pleasure.
And we hope you'll join us for as much of the rest of the weekend as you can at the live events. Thank you so much again on our behalf, and we hope we can lure you to West Cork in person in future.
That's not going to take any persuasion, Simon. I look forward to continuing the conversation in due course at some point in the future. But for now, thank you for your attention this afternoon and the conversation. I just wish we were all going off to the pub now that's the downside of doing it on Zoom. But thank you for the invitation and great to chat to everybody. So stay well, and I'll join you throughout the festival. There's some great sessions coming up.
Well, thank you, and thank you for that cue as well. The next one will be at 4 p.m. when we're going to have a panel discussion on partition, and then subsequent to that, the next session will be at 6:30 p.m. When Roy Foster will talk to us with the intriguing title "Staying On or Staying Put," and then finally today at 8:30 we'll have our festival concert. So all of those still available for people who want to join them. And we look forward to seeing you, or as many of you as possible, at the next one. Thank you.
Bye. Take care.